Hi, third grade students. Today, I get to read a story aloud to you. And by the end of the read aloud, you will know so much about how boys and girls were educated during the colonial period that you will be able to compare your own education to the education of boys and girls during the colonial period. So, by the end of our lesson today, you will be able to compare and contrast the education of boys and girls during the colonial period and today. And we know when we compare and contrast, we say two ways that their education was similar to ours and two ways that their education was different from our education. Boys and girls, would you please get out a notebook, a piece of scratch paper if you have one, your pencil, and your ELA packet. Thank you so much. So, we're going to begin with some vocabulary. You know that after the European explorers came to the Americas, colonies were established, and more people came from Europe to settle in these colonies. A colony is an area settled by a group of people from another country that remains connected to the newly settled area and its people. For example, the people who left England to settle on the Roanoke Island colony were not prepared for the difficult times they would experience in the New World. An apprentice is a person who is learning a trade or art by experience under a skilled worker. For example, Abraham became an apprentice at age 11 when he learned how to be a blacksmith from his uncle. So boys and girls, today you will learn that during the colonial times, children actually became apprentices. They learned how to do specific trades from skilled tradesmen. So we're going to learn about how part of their education, at least for boys, was becoming apprentices or having apprenticeships. Established means set up, started, or created. For example, the Lorenzonis established their family fun-run shoe store many years ago, and it's one of the oldest businesses in town. Boys and girls, you're going to learn today about how the schools were established during colonial times. So, today you will listen very carefully to hear how the education of boys and girls during the colonial period is similar and different to your education today. So think about your education today. What topics do you learn? What does your school day look like? How many teachers do you have? Who do you learn from? What are some of your favorite subjects? Yes, so be thinking about what your education is like today so that you can compare your education to education during the colonial period. I have a task for you. Would you please pause the video and draw a graphic organizer just like this on your paper? On one side, so please draw a line down the middle of your paper and draw a T-chart. On one side, would you take notes about education in colonial America for boys and girls? So make a box for boys and for girls. On the other side, in the other column, please label that Education Today and make a box for boys and girls. Throughout this read aloud, this note sheet will become very important because we're going to take notes together so that we can be very successful with the writing today. Thank you. Pause the video and make sure you have a note sheet that looks just like this. Fantastic. And you're listening for how boys were educated in colonial America and how girls were educated in colonial America so that you can compare it to how we are educated today. So you're listening for any information about the education of children during the colonial period. What was their school like? You're going to take any notes about that. Please sit up straight and be really focused and listening so that you're able to learn about the education of boys and girls in the colonial period. Okay, in our first lesson, you learned about some reasons why people from all over Europe traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean to establish and live in the 13 colonies. Kings, trading companies, and Englishmen all realized that North America had enormous potential. In other words, they all thought they could get rich there. Others wanted to start a new life, free of religious intolerance and persecution. People from England and other parts of Europe traveled to different regions for many different reasons. Slowly, these regions and the colonies within them began to take shape. The southern colonies had warm weather and adequate rainfall. Small farms and large plantations began to dot the landscape. The large plantations had many enslaved Africans working on them. The economy in the South was based on farming cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. Tobacco, rice, and indigo were exported to England and the West Indies and sold by merchants there. Trade among all of the 13 colonies began to grow. The soil in New England was not suitable for farming. There were some small farms, but due to the abundance of forests, timber became an important trade good. Over in England, many of the forests had been cut down by the time the colonies were established. So timber, used to make ships and homes, were exported to England. Other colonies also needed timber to build fishing and trading ships, homes, and barrows. Farming was a main source of income in the middle colonies. Wheat was grown so abundantly that this region had a special name, the breadbasket. Mills were built and wheat produced. Large amounts of flour was also sold to England and its colonies in the West Indies. Settlers from all around the world came to this region, resulting in a very wide variety of cultures within the middle colonies. So boys and girls, so far, do I have anything to add to my note sheet about the education in colonial America? Not yet, so we'll just keep on listening. Can you imagine what it was like to grow up back then? Let's find out what life was like in the English colonies. In the early days, only boys who lived in the English colonies got to go to school. Ooh, I would definitely write that down in the boys section of my graphic organizer. I would write down only boys could go to school. The first schools were one-room schoolhouses, like in this picture. There's just one room in the entire school, and all of the boys studied there. Boys of all different ages were in the same schoolhouse, and they learned reading, writing, and math. Sometimes the older boys helped to teach the younger ones. In 1647, a law was passed in Massachusetts that required every town with 50 or more families to support an elementary school. Towns with more than 100 families had to support a grammar school, where boys would learn Latin to prepare for college. So I would write down, boys and girls, that boys learned reading, writing, and math and Latin in their school. This was the beginning of public education in America. Over time, every colony began to provide basic public education. So, boys and girls, pause the video and get out your note sheet. Let's see if you got down all the information from that first paragraph. What do we know about how boys were educated? What would you write down, or what did you write down? Well, what did boys learn? So only boys attended school. Did you write that down? If you didn't, make sure that you do. In school, boys learned reading, writing, and math. Boys learned the Latin language. So that's what we learned about education in colonial America so far. So I put that in the boys section. We haven't learned anything about the education of girls. So I'm going to leave that blank and keep listening. So you're taking notes in these two sections about what school was like for boys and girls during colonial America. Keep listening. This paragraph has a lot about what boys and girls learned back then. Some boys attended private schools, and others were educated at home. Puritan girls were taught to read so that they could read the Bible. For many children, the main part of their education was learning a skill so that they could grow up and support a family. For girls, that meant learning household skills, such as cooking, keeping a vegetable garden, sewing, making candles, and even how to raise children. Some girls might learn to become dressmakers. So boys and girls, we just learned a little bit about what school was like for girls. Well, they didn't go to school, so you could write that in the girls column. They didn't attend school, but they did learn some things at home. They learned how to read so that they could read the Bible. That would be something to write down. They also learned household skills such as cooking, keeping a vegetable garden, sewing, making candles, and how to take care of kids. So you can write down that that's what the education was like for girls. Look, they learned to read and learn to sew and help in the garden, but they didn't go to school. Do you think that that's fair? I'm going to keep going. For boys, farming was one of the main occupations. There were many different kinds of apprenticeships too. Boys as young as age 11 years old would become apprentices and learn a skill from an experienced artisan. They could learn to be shoemakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, shipbuilders, printers, merchants, and glassmakers. They could also become lawyers, doctors, or teachers, but girls could not. We just learned so much new information from this paragraph. So get out your note sheet and let's write a little bit down. Okay, so we already knew quite a bit about boys, but we also learned that they could learn a skill so that they could grow up and support their family. They also had apprenticeships, and I listed some of them. Make sure that you list them too. And they also could leave home at age 11 to live as an apprentice to learn one of these skills. What did you write about how girls learned? How were they educated? Yes, they were only able to learn how to read. They weren't able to attend school, and they were only taught to read so that they could read the Bible. Awesome listening. They also learned household skills such as cooking, keeping a garden, sewing, making candles, and raising children. So let's think about how is that different from your education today. Pause the video and think about how the education of children in colonial America is different than your education today. So let's write some ways it's different. Back then, only boys attended school. We know back then, boys only learned reading, writing, and math. Today, boys attend school, so that's something they have in common. And we learn some of the same things. We still learn reading, writing, and math, but we also learn science and social studies. Back then, boys learned skills so that they could grow up and support a family and had apprenticeships. But today, boys don't have an apprenticeship, and if they do, they have to be much older. And now, boys are able to have any job through hard work, and boys live with their family until they're 18. Back then, they would sometimes leave their homes when they were 11. Can you think of any other ways they're different? Back then, girls were not able to attend school. How is the education of girls very different today? Girls do attend schools just like boys. Back then, girls were only taught to read so that they could read the Bible. What about today? In school, girls learn reading, writing, math, science, and social studies just like the boys. Back then, girls only learned household skills such as cooking, keeping a garden, and sewing. Today, girls are able to have any occupation through hard work, and thank goodness for that. I'm going to read just a little bit more, and then we'll prepare you for the assignment today. Even young children had lots of chores to do. If you lived on a farm, and many people did, you would gather firewood, tend to the farm animals, milk the cows, collect eggs from the chickens, make candles, plant and harvest vegetables, and carry water from the well. Almost all of your food came from your farm. All of this had to be accomplished without the luxuries of electricity, plumbing, or heating and air conditioning. So that's much different than our lives today because these children spent a lot of time doing chores. Is that similar to your life? Okay, so you can pause the video and make sure that you have all the way education in colonial America was similar to education today and how it was different. Make sure you have all of these notes. So pause the video and update your note sheet. You can even add more to your note sheet. Let's start thinking about some ways education in colonial America is similar to education today. Let me grab my highlighter. Let's highlight any ways that they're similar. So back then, boys attended school, which is similar to today. Back then, boys learned reading, writing, and math. And today, boys learn reading, writing, and math. But it's a little different because they also learn more subjects. Let's see, is there any other ways that they're the same? Girls were taught to read. Well, girls today are also taught to read, but thank goodness they're taught so many other things as well so that they can contribute to our society. Back then, maybe they learned household skills and had chores just like we have them today. So there are a couple ways that they are the same. I highlighted them, but mostly the education back then was very, very different. So your paragraphs could say, education during colonial America was much different than education today, but there were a few similarities. This is your assignment for today. You're going to write a complete paragraph comparing and contrasting the different ways boys and girls were educated in colonial America and today. I started this for you. I said the ways boys and girls were educated in colonial America and today were very different, yet there were a few similarities. First, education during colonial America was different because, well, my first supporting detail could be something like, well, because only boys were educated at school. And then I would elaborate. Only boys went to school to learn reading, writing, and math. The girls were not able to attend school. They had to stay home. Then I would say another way that they were different. Finally, I need to say 2 ways they're the same and then a conclusion sentence. I cannot wait to see your paragraph writing today, 3rd graders. Thank you for your tremendous listening.